there's certain traits that will predict performance within a certain context, right? And so some of the work we do with validation work, especially at a local job family level, is all about that. It's establishing the job relevance from a legal standpoint, but also figuring out what are the specific traits and at what level do those traits predict performance for those different, you might say, environments, but really it's what they're doing in the job too.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. Employers are increasingly recognizing that the traditional hiring process isn't ideal. Generally, that's something like you post a job, you collect resumes, the hiring manager interviews a few potentially qualified candidates based on their education and their previous job titles, and then the hiring manager selects the one they like best, relying mostly on their gut. In previous episodes of this podcast, we've talked about the shift away from credentials to competencies, the importance of cultural fit within an organization, and how behavior styles affect performance. But each of these factors can seem subjective. How do we measure them objectively? And heck, how do we even know what to measure? Well, joining me today to discuss the use of assessments in the employee selection and development process is Brandon Jordan. Brandon is an organizational psychologist and scientist focused on the study of people, attitudes, emotions, and behavior in the workplace. He's the founder of Workforce Lifecycle Analytics, a firm that partners with clients to grow their business through their people, focusing on talent management and organizational development initiatives and programs. He's also a returning guest. Back in 2022, we talked about employee engagement and quiet quitting. That's a throwback term now. It's a throwback Thursday. We haven't heard quiet quitting in a while. So welcome back to Good Morning HR, Brandon.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience about something that I'm really passionate about, and share what I know about.
And I know you are, and that's why I wanted to get you on here.
Yeah.
So if you Google employee assessments, you're going to find a ton of vendors who want to sell you an assessment of some sort. Some of them just want to sell you a one and done assessment over the internet, and others want to offer consulting to help you choose the right kind of assessment for whatever the need at hand is. So let's start by talking about the different kinds of assessments and situations where each might be appropriate for an employer.
Yeah. And I'd start, Mike, by saying if you Google employee assessment, a lot of stuff will come up. And I would say the vast majority, 80-90% of those offering assessments online are what I might call technology first organizations, where they have a slick technology platform. They've had some leaders that have founded that company, but really didn't understand how to create a psychological assessment that's worth its salt, essentially. So 80-90% of the assessments that are on the market, I probably wouldn't advise people to pursue, honestly. And those can be any number of types of assessments too. I mean, we can talk about behavioral assessments, cognitive ability, skills assessments. I mean, there's so many under the umbrella of employee assessment that we could talk about. I would say the majority out there are what we might call personality, work style, behavioral assessment. And that's one area I have a deep specialty in, but I know a thing or two about almost all of them, at least. But really starting there, the market is just saturated with what I would say that are providers that, they have like a Ferrari body on the outside, the slick technology, but you flip the hood open and it's kind of a go-kart engine underneath there, like all of the best practices for establishing a good psychometric measurement really isn't there.
Well, that's interesting because that's the same thing in my industry, right? I mean, you can go online and buy a background check and, for $30 or $50. And if you don't know the exact questions to ask and, to challenge them, and then if you can even get anybody in customer support to answer your questions when you want to, ask, employers just don't know, and so they don't come to a company like Imperative that's really thorough and focuses on getting it done right until something's gone wrong, right? And so,
Yeah.
and I imagine in your world, what's happening is, we've been using this assessment online, and we've still got the turnover issues we've got, or we're still not getting the right fits, or people with the cognitive ability to do this role, and we've spent all this time and money and turnover, and now we need to figure it out. And it's you're probably like me, your best clients are the ones who've been burned doing it cheap before.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the cost of buying something that's not reputable and causing more pain than
Mhm.
the solving the issue you're trying to solve for can be pretty painful for a lot of clients. And you touched on something there is like knowing the right questions to ask. And so when I talk about this a lot, I go and speak at SHRM chapters and conferences and things on this topic. I really try to educate HR professionals on what questions you should ask. And I'll share, happy to share a couple of those real quick, right? So, first question I would ask any assessment provider, especially a behavioral assessment, is do you have a technical validation manual? Do you have a document that shows the science that you did the best practices and created this thing where it establishes the validity and reliability of it? Again, kind of going back to my previous comment, 80-90% of the companies out there won't have this readily available. And some do. You can go to their website and you can download it. You don't even have to ask the company. They'll allow you to download it from their website. That's question number one. Another thing that's more difficult for HR practitioners to really know is how good is the technical manual. It's really hard. You need a little bit more time than we have today to educate on what really good reliability and validity really are. But if they have that first thing in place, that technical manual, that's a green flag, right? That's a green flag that you move forward. There's assessment providers out there that they'll say they have a technical manual, and it'll be more of a white paper and not really the analysis and validation. It'll just be something written up saying, it's kind of sound sciencey and there's no real numbers behind it, no real empirical evidence. So I've seen that as well. They pass it off as a technical manual, but it's really not. Another question is, do you have an organizational psychologist on staff? Did organizational psychologists at least help you develop this? Those are some good markers of a reputable assessment.
And I want to dive into validation, but let's go. Okay, so you mentioned behavioral assessments. What are we typically, when you're talking about a behavioral assessment, what are we really measuring there?
Yeah, so it really comes down to personality, I would say, and
The big
more,
five, those kind of things,
yeah,
or
big
ocean.
five, exactly. So let's go into some green flags for behavioral assessments, right? And I want to talk about it in terms of kind of two different classes of assessments. So you have typology assessments, and those are the assessments that are on the market that people know the most, right? So think Myers-Briggs, DISC, Strength Finders. Those are more typology-based assessments. They use what we call ipsative measure, where it's a forced choice rather than a Likert scale. And the virtue of them is they paint in pretty broad strokes and they bucket people into these different types. The advantage there is it's really easy to implement, really easy to understand. Some of these are just simplified down to colors, like I'm a red or a green or a blue. The truth of the matter is human behavior is much more complex than that, right? It's much more nuanced, and it's really also really dependent upon the environment. So much, some of those assessments will even measure you and give you output on how you are normally versus how you are at work, for example, right? You take the most extroverted person in the world and if they're at a funeral, they're probably going to taper down their extrovertedness at that in that environment, right? So there's a lot of concomitants that come into play. But the typology assessments are good for almost a singular purpose. It's more for development and team cohesion. And they really shouldn't be used for talent decisions in the workplace. In fact, you can get into some legal trouble if you do implement those assessments using them for talent decisions. It's not illegal to do, but if you're challenged, in the back of the technical manuals of these assessments, in fine print, it says you shouldn't do this.
Yeah, and you see, and if you look close enough on a lot of their websites, and again, you say, like you say, it's in small print. There are people out there selling those things, disc or whatever, some version of disc, and they'll, if you read everything on the website, you'll find that paragraph that says this is for development and team building, those kind of things, and it shouldn't be used to make an employment decision or hiring or selection decision. But it's readily available, and we've all heard about it, and we all know that what our discs. And I live by my disc style. I mean, I know exactly what it
Okay.
is. I know what everybody on
Yeah.
my team is, but but they do tend to say, if you look carefully, don't use this in employment context. But then you hear a
Right.
lot of people saying, well, we use them in employment context because and quite honestly, if you happen to get it right and you're not, correlation isn't causation, but sometimes you just say, okay, I look at disc and I see the people who've worked best in this organization on this particular role have a low D, a low I, a high S, a high C, and you can get it. But like you say, and I want to get into some of the EEOC issues and the uniform guidelines. It works until it doesn't, until you're creating a disparate impact. So anyway, so there's behavioral assessments. Oh, and you mentioned topology. Then there was the other kind. So let's talk about that.
Right. Yeah, and I would largely say that we'll just talk about it in terms of like some more green flags, right? So if I was to recommend somebody use a behavioral assessment, the first thing I would ask a provider is say, is your assessment rooted in the five factor model, the big five personality model, which is an acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is emotional stability. And those all have subfacets. Like I said, personality is very complex, right? There's subfacets under each one of those, what you might call meta traits that we can measure. And so, is it rooted in that empirical model? That's what we found to be kind of the strongest model to actually measure behavior in people. Um, Beyond that, it's some other things, right? And so it can be rooted in that. Sometimes your model comes out different. Our model has uh, one extra overall factor. The Hogan Assessment Suite, the HPI, it's rooted in the Big Five, for example. There's a number of assessments on the market that are rooted in that. Then does it have the evidence where it predicts performance? Is it job related? And now we're bumping up into things that are both best practices and also I wouldn't say legally mandated, but markers for legal protection under the EOC guidelines and on truthfully case law that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, for example.
And so there's behavioral assessments, and then we've got cognitive, and we've used cognitive assessments for uh, 15 years probably at least, and we found those to be really valuable,
Yeah.
especially as we've hired more remote employees who we may not have the ability to work side by side with and really develop and train. So finding people who can work, who can get up to speed quicker.
Yeah.
So talk about cognitive assessments and the pros and cons there, what we should be looking for when we're looking at those.
Yeah. I think before I talk about that, what I would recommend to anybody looking to implement an employee assessment, you never want to use one methodology as your kind of end all be all, right? What we find even in the scientific evidence of these things is if you bring multiple methodologies together, the likelihood that you're making the right pick for the high performer increases twofold, right? So using a trait, behavioral personality, along with the structured interview and a cognitive ability assessment, for
Mm-hmm.
example, you're really increasing your likelihood to pick the right person. That being said, what we often would recommend in using cognitive tools is to use it in concert with other things. I would probably never implement or recommend implementing a cognitive tool as a standalone, as an employee talent decision for a client, because it has some issues that bump into some legal risk. What we find cross culturally quite a bit as well, but there's race ethnicity differences with cognitive ability measurement, and some of this is rooted in some socioeconomic things as well. We find that as well. But in essence, you're bumping up on EOC risk with that for protected groups. So we find that, for example, just kind of going down the list, it's like Asian background, Jewish background tend to be at the top. White, slowly, white Caucasian follows after that, and then towards the bottom, we find Black, African American, and Hispanic people tend to kind of be across the spectrum from top to bottom there. And so implementing those without some kind of counterbalance to say, okay, like let's get a fuller picture of this person on whether they're going to be a good performer, a good fit for this across multiple methodologies is usually recommended just in general, but also because of some of the risks in using the cognitive measures.
Yeah, and combined with the behavioral assessment and, like you said, that structured interview. I mean, and I've always used the behavioral assessment primarily as to help me design the structured interview for that person. So if I see a behavior pattern that's contrary to where we would normally go, but the person's otherwise fully qualified and they're in the right range cognitively from the assessment, then I'm going to use all those results to say, okay, here's the kind of questions we want to follow up on. Let's peel this onion a little deeper and figure out what's really going on here. And on the cognitive side, and what I found is that people, there's a range there, and if somebody scores higher than that range, we have less success too. And especially in our data, our high level data entry roles, there's you can I guess in some roles, I've never had this problem, but you can be too smart for your own good, and maybe, and they just can't. They've not performed as well. But we've really narrowed down over 15 years that range for that cognitive. So we know if they score in this range, we're probably going to have success. But if they're above it or below it, and everything else is right, that's not going to eliminate them from consideration.
Right. Yeah. And I want to go back and say it's not just legal risks. Like, for implementing these, it might behoove you strategically, if your organization isn't very diverse, to make sure you're using multiple methods. So you're making sure you're bringing some of the diverse background in your company. But also,
why make it harder on yourself to hire people by having a test that's,
exactly.
we're getting, you can get overly dogmatic about this and then just make it really hard to hire people.
And I've been hearing, I'm a bit addicted to TikTok for multiple reasons, but I've been hearing some buzz on some people talking on TikTok about people that are high IQ being not neurotypical, right? And so, like, that is that
Right.
going to eventually fall under the kind of ADA type stuff, perhaps? I don't know, because there's evidence out there to say people that have high IQ tend to struggle socially and have a number of other, like, anxiety problems and things like that too, right? So it's like there's these concomitants with people that at the higher end of the cognitive ability spectrum that, you're right, they might not be as successful for multiple reasons. And that's not really fleshed out yet, but I'm starting to smell it in the air a little bit there.
Well, and we did an episode earlier this year about hiring people who are neurodivergent and the benefits that employers have found working with those folks. And not every job do you need to be able to look somebody in the eye and have a firm handshake, and maybe in some cases the ability to really focus on a problem exclusive of the environment around you is a real asset.
Absolutely. I'll go back to another green flag that also aligns with legal requirements: is establishing job relevance is the legal requirement for implementing an assessment. But beyond that, it's rooted in science as well. One of my advisors in grad school, he had something called trait activation theory. And really what that is saying that there's certain traits that will predict performance within a certain context, right? So if an example might be bartender, right? You might need to be higher sociability, higher extroversion for that role in that environment. Where accountant, its detail orientation is needed to be high, and sociability might actually detract from performance in that role. And so some of the work we do with validation work, especially at a local job family level, is all about that. It's establishing the job relevance from a legal standpoint, but also figuring out What are the specific traits, and at what level do those traits predict performance for those different, uh, you might say, environments, but really it's what they're doing in the job too.
Right. You're not going to hire somebody with low sociability and low dominance, let's say, for
Yeah,
an outside sales role that's kind of a high pressure sale, but they
yeah,
may be perfect for an in-house sales role for a really technical role. And so you got to think through those. That's behavioral, and we talked about cognitive, just measuring it. Say what it means when we say we're measuring cognitive ability.
yeah. So it's the mental horsepower. It tends to be historically pretty correlated with job performance. Both measures do. Cognitive ability historically has been a stronger predictor of job performance. Um, it's that mental horsepower, right? And it can be measured in multiple ways. So you have things like the Watson-Glaser, where it's just reasoning, verbal ability, math ability. These all tend to get at what scientists call general mental ability, or GMA. And there's multiple avenues to kind of measure these things, but all of those methods tend to get at what we're really looking for is how quickly can this person learn unique things and perform fast, and how much can they learn, right? And so that's essentially what those things tend to predict. And the outcomes that we see in the scientific literature are that job performance and how training performance, for example.
And so behavioral and cognitive.
Yeah.
What other kind of assessments are out there that are either seem to you to be just voodoo, or maybe have some reliability behind them?
So some voodoo stuff that's out there. There's it's not really prevalent in the United States, but people have done handwriting stuff in the past.
Hmm.
It's actually pretty prevalent, I think, in India. Maybe not prevalent, but it's more popular there. People will even look at lines in your hands and things like that. I came across somebody recently. He's a professional speaker, and he's going and telling people that facial structure of people is related to personality. And it kind of reminds me of phrenology, of let me read the bumps on your head.
And I know who you're talking about. Yeah, I've seen him a couple times. Yeah.
Yeah. And so some of that's kind of wild to me. I don't, there might be something to it. I'm not going to say there's not, but there's just no scientific evidence, I think, that exists for any of that stuff, truthfully. Right. And so I even run into people that aren't very won't endorse personality assessment, for example. But there's a mountain of 100 years of scientific evidence that's to the contrary, that we can measure these things. It is difficult. It is hard. And oftentimes we get false positives and false negatives with our measurements, but we've gotten pretty good at it still. And there's something to it.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. For many employers, any review of a candidate's social media profile is taboo. That is a privacy line they are simply unwilling to cross. But within the confines of Title VII and other anti-discrimination laws, a candidate's off-duty conduct, including how they conduct themselves on social media, may be relevant. For example, if the employee engages in illegal or negligent conduct on the job that might have been predictable, and therefore preventable, had the employer simply reviewed the publicly available information about them on the internet, the plaintiff's lawyers will certainly be using that information in a negligent hiring suit. For some positions, threatening, coercive, or bigoted online behavior may be a legitimate concern. In other instances, references to personal drug use or criminal behavior may be relevant. Imperative helps clients conduct necessary online due diligence while building guardrails around the process to ensure that irrelevant or potentially discriminatory information isn't provided to decision makers. You can learn more about the many ways Imperative helps our clients make well-informed decisions about the people they involve in their business at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 3/4 of a recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 153 and enter the keyword validation. That's VALIDATION. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with Brandon Jordan. And so when we're talking about validation, I think you mentioned construct earlier, but there's, under the uniform guidelines, there are three kinds of validation, I think, that are recognized. But can you just kind of go through when we say it's validated, what does that really mean, and what are the kinds of validations?
Yeah. So what you're looking for in a technical manual is the construct content validity. So did the scientist, organizational psychologist create this to measure what it says it's measuring, right? So the 5-factor model, for example, we have those 5 factors. Those emerge empirically from the data in what we call factor analysis, right? And so whenever we do a factor analysis amongst, 300 to 100,000 people that take a personality assessment, some form of that emerges from the data in almost every data set. And so those factors tend to be what you call orthogonal or independent of each other. There might be a little overlap between, but they're not measuring the same thing. So being extrovert is not the same thing as being conscientious at the highest level. Then, there's subfacets. Can you demonstrate that in the data that these things are independent of each other? But within, you brought it up earlier, 2 subfacets of extroversion are sociability and dominance, for example. Those tend to be orthogonal of each other within that factor, but still overlap within the overarching factor of extroversion. So, like I said, it's a complex thing to measure all of this stuff with all the interrelated connections, but that's construct validity. Are we measuring these things in a way that is reflective of real world behavior? And there's all kinds of interesting studies on this, right? So, for example, there's longitudinal studies that will measure how long babies cry when they're little. And that tends to be correlated with adult levels of emotional stability and neuroticism, for example. So you cry more, you have lower levels of emotional stability as an adult. There's all kinds of interesting studies like that verify that we're measuring what we're intending to measure, right? So construct validity in the tech manual, and then you want to really, really look for criterion validity, or what we might call, or I would describe as, are these things correlated with something in the real world that's of importance, right? So within the employee context, are your measures correlated with employee performance? Are they correlated with organizational citizenship behaviors, being nice to other people? Are they correlated with turnover or retention? So is there a criterion that the assessment is tied to that it tends to predict? And not only is that a good thing to implement an instrument for your organization, there's Supreme Court case law that says, that's a practice that needs to really be in place. So job relatedness came from case law. Mm-hmm. Is it correlated in predicting performance comes from case law as well. Not only were the scientists starting to do this, and that's how it got brought about in these court cases, but they're like, oh, you did the best practices. You did the things that you needed to do. We're good with that. And in fact, it's built into case law now.
And so we get construct and criterion. And then I think the thing that's, we can find an assessment and we can try to shoehorn it into a certain job, but it's still this, an accountant in a big accounting firm may be very different than an accountant working in a corporate accounting office. And so the behaviors, that in one role, even though it's, very similar skills, may be very different in a similar role in a different environment. And so what do we do to tie it back to make sure that we're really picking the right thing for that job?
Good, great question, right? And so another green flag to look for in an assessment organization is, do they have an assessment in place for this specific job family? And what we do there is what we call validity generalization, right? So if for my company, for example, if we've done, 10 criterion related validity studies for clients in customer service, for example, we're looking across 10 different companies, 1,000 different employees, where we have both the assessment data and that employee outcome, that performance data, where we've demonstrated that it's predictive, that it's job related, that it's related to those roles. We can make the logical leap there and generalize those findings, that validity, to another customer service organization. There's sufficient evidence that this validity generalizes to your role in your new company. You are right. There are extenuating circumstances, right? So like an accountant within a company that's, 50 people, is very different than a very specialized accountant that's doing, like forensic accounting in one of the big accounting firms, right? That's more a generalist versus a very technical role. And we'd probably want to have that conversation with that client and say, hey, might not be a one-to-one match for you here. We would recommend probably doing some job analysis and kind of figuring out some of the nuances here on why it might be different, and recommending maybe we build a specific scoring algorithm for your roles for an assessment. So a customized assessment algorithm for your company, perhaps, that's localized and not generalized validity, specific validity for your employee population. So there's conversations to be had there. Can we do a little bit of job analysis to generalize the validity, or can we say, hey, you can buy this off the shelf, let's say, and we're pretty confident that it's going to 80-90% map onto the behaviors that are needed for that role.
So once we've implemented an assessment, and maybe, what is that? We always do the plan, do, check, act thing. And so when we get down to the check part, and we've implemented it, and now we want to see, did this work for us? When do we do that? And what kind of measures do we use to fairly evaluate it?
Yeah. So, there's a number of things you can do, and you can measure even as in the client organizations can measure as well. But I'll start by saying is we follow up in aggregate. We're not trying to get every single one right. That's not the name of this game. The name of the game is, can we not select the worst two employees that you did in the past and instead select two of the best, increasing your selection rate by 40%, maybe. That's great. I mean, it's kind of like in a way gambling, right? You're trying to beat the house here just by a few percentage points if you can, right? So if we can cut out the worst 10-20% of hires and
That'll save a
therefore
fortune,
improve
right?
the
Yeah.
top end by that much, we're doing great. And it's about that long-term game. And for us to establish that, we need a sufficient sample size to prove that analytically, right? So with our clients, what we do is we'll follow up and have a hiring review a year, well, sometimes 6 months to a year to 2 years out, to check in with them, to say, okay, let's look at fairness, bias, adverse impact evidence. Let's look at just your compliance for your hiring managers and your recruiters. Are they actually hiring the people that their assessments are recommending, or are they not doing that at all and just going with their gut? So we go in and evaluate some of those things with every client, right? We can easily get the data and be able to do that. Beyond that, we can follow up and do a predictive validation study where we get, after we have 100 of those people, and they've been on the job for at least a year, and incumbents for at least 100 people, hopefully up to 300. We can get performance data on them and their assessment data and say, okay, is this still predicting performance? Sometimes there's elements that are change with the job, and over time that the predictive model might change a little bit. It's like, oh, like you implemented this new technology, like people aren't knocking on doors anymore. They're actually using LinkedIn to do sales and things like that. I just kind of plucked that out of the air, but whatever, how does maybe change in the environment or whatever with that job tends to change what predicts performance for it sometimes, right? And so we can have that discussion and say, okay, like why isn't this specific trait predicting anymore, right? And sometimes that happens. But following up, doing another validity study. Another thing clients can do is just measure some of those training performance stuff. And a lot of clients don't do a great job on measuring performance. Usually we come in and
Tell me
measure
about it.
our own performance for them.
Yeah, and that, I mean, we talk. Well, we can close here with uniform guidelines and disparate impact in Title VII, but the it goes back to the bigger issue is why are we going to make it? We need to have good performance measures in our organization anyway, and if we make it hard to hire people, but we also don't manage performance well, the quality of our data when we go back to evaluate our processes isn't going to be very good. So I don't know if a hiring process is working well if my managers aren't actively managing and supervising their employees and following the processes that we've laid out. It's harder to measure, and so we make it harder. So no tool in the world is going to really help you if your management's not going to if you're not going to have good supervisors, if you're not going to invest in training and making sure that they know how to use the tools and how to where there's a challenge, bring performance up and reward and incentivize people, all those things. But let's talk about, let's wrap up with, I've mentioned the uniform guidelines, the ESC's uniform guidelines on employee selection procedures. Kind of run through the risk there. I mean, because it's really, protected class is a disparate impact on a protected class, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the three big buckets there tend to be age, ethnicity, and gender, and that's expanded here recently on the gender side. And there's difference between EOC and OFCCP, for example. OFCCP is the federal government's
contractors, right? Yeah.
Similar to EEOC. Any organization that's doing any work with the federal government falls under the OFCCP, and there's more requirements for that. They have to proactively produce reports and file with them on affirmative action and things like that, for example. So in general, the OFCCP tends to be more proactive. EEOC is reactive. So anytime that I've been involved with any client interaction where there's been an EEOC challenge, which that means there's been an employee that felt like they were discriminated against, and they file a claim with the EEOC.
And discriminated because of being in a protected class, that they had a disparate impact. That your test is pushing me out because of my age or my race or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. And they would petition our organization when I was with IBM and Connexa and say, hey, we have this claim. And essentially what we would do is, if it was a localized validation study and job analysis that we did for a client, we would write up a technical documentation on it all. It was a 10 to 20 page, really sleeping pill is what it was, real sleeping material there. And you send that into the EOC, and it outlines all of the things that you did from a job analysis standpoint to establish job relevance, all of the data analysis that you did to establish the criterion validity. And essentially, they don't have much of a case if it's established as a good assessment. And it's not 25 years old that you did the validity study as well. That's pretty much an insurance policy by doing that to protect yourself. And not only that, it's best practice, right? You want to be sure that the things that you're doing are, impacting your organization and predicting performance and being fair. And so there's the 4/5 and a number of other statistical ways that we can go in and determine whether an assessment is having any kind of impact like that. And real quick, I just wanted to mention, and I know you're a big AI proponent, artificial intelligence proponent, Mike.
But there's some really bad stuff in the AI world right now, I think, related to this. Yeah, talk about that.
Yeah. And so over the last 10, 15 years, what's happened is essentially people have built these AI tools, and they've been built by people. And what happens is it seems that the AI machine learning algorithms, they get in there and they perpetuate our own biases almost, they
Bias in, bias out. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Google famously shut off an algorithm that they had that was selecting engineers for them. It was super biased towards men, super biased towards, I think that some kind of sport for
Yeah.
men as well.
Was it Google or was it Amazon? But they
It's
had
one of the two.
it was even if when they took the names out and any references they could think of to gender, it was recognizing if they played softball, they're probably female and
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah,
So
exactly.
it's correlation's not causation, and so that's the problem. It wasn't intentional bias on the part of whoever the employer was, and it wasn't
Yeah,
intentional bias on the
unintentional.
part of the AI. It's
Yeah,
just gathering data and doing it. I'll tell you the one that scares me is there's a company out there that does the online recording of interviews.
yeah,
They pose a question and you record your answer, and basically they're claiming that they can use AI and neurolinguistic study to develop somebody's behavioral assessment based on that, which tells me, okay, you're going to create a bias automatically against neurolinguistic or neurodiverse people.
yeah,
And I was talking to somebody at a dinner party I was at in New York a couple of weeks ago, who's an MIT guy who's working on that. And I said, "So how are you adjusting the facial recognition for people with darker skin and the challenges of?" Oh well, we haven't fixed that problem yet. And so
yeah.
they're out there raising capital and testing this product, but they in this company they haven't rolled it out to market. But I've seen similar products on the market now, and I think that's going to get some people in trouble.
Yeah, and I think there's already been some out of court settlements for things in the last 10, 15 years where certain companies doing that. And right now, what we're seeing is at the state level and city level, there's a lot of legislation. Colorado just had something. I read an article yesterday about they're coming out with a big push for that. California is the same. New York
New York
City
City's done it.
has
Yeah.
already passed something that's one of the most stringent, but it also has the most loopholes, it seems, as well. Like it's kind of EEOC-esque where it's doesn't really make an impact unless it's challenged, essentially.
Right.
But yeah, all of that stuff is coming at the state level for the AI stuff related to employee assessments, and it's going to be exciting. Maybe it's going to be scary.
Well,
Soon we'll see.
we'll
One
pay
way or the
attention
other.
and we'll get you back to talk about it some more. But that's all the time we've got. Thanks for joining me, Branda.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.